The gavel came down like a gunshot. "Order," Judge Harlan Price said, his voice cutting through the packed courtroom like a blade through dry summer grass. "I will have order in this court, or I will clear every last soul from this building." The murmuring died, but the tension did not. It pressed against the walls of the Redemption Creek courthouse like floodwater behind a dam, and every soul present could feel the weight of what was about to happen. At the front of the room, in a wooden chair that looked more like a throne of condemnation than furniture, sat Genevieve Mercer. Her wrists were bound with rope, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her green eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd as though she had already made her peace with whatever verdict was coming. She was 24 years old, and if the prosecution had its way, she would hang before the end of the month. The charge was murder. The victim was Harold Crane, the most powerful cattle baron in all of Larimer County, Colorado. A man so thoroughly woven into the fabric of this town that you could not separate his name from its streets, its commerce, or its law. And there sat Genevieve Mercer, accused of putting a bullet through him on a Tuesday night in October of 1882, with no alibi and no one willing to stand up and say otherwise. No one, until now. The courtroom had gone so quiet that the creak of boot, leather on floorboards sounded like thunder, when Deputy Thomas Yancey stood up from the gallery bench. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it, and a jaw set so hard it looked carved from the same red Colorado rock that surrounded the town. His badge caught the light from the tall windows, throwing a brief flash across the ceiling. Judge Price looked down at him over a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. "Deputy Yancey, you are out of order." "With respect, Your Honor," Thomas said, and his voice did not waver by even a fraction. "I am exactly where I need to be." He moved through the gallery, past the row of townspeople who had come to watch a woman condemned, past the prosecutor with his polished shoes and his borrowed certainty, past the two deputies standing near the side door who exchanged uncertain glances as he walked. He stopped at the front of the room and turned to face the judge with the full, unblinking weight of a man who had made his choice and was not taking it back under any circumstances. "I will vouch for her with my name," Thomas Yancey said. The room erupted. It took Judge Price nearly a full minute to restore quiet, and even then the air crackled like the sky before a lightning storm. Genevieve had turned to look at Thomas for the first time, and the expression on her face was not relief. It was something closer to devastation, as though she understood better than anyone in that room exactly what he was risking and exactly what it would cost him. But Thomas Yancey had not arrived at this moment by accident. He had spent 6 days tearing through every dark corner of Redemption Creek, following every buried thread, turning over every stone that someone powerful had wanted left in the ground. And now, standing at the front of this courtroom with the whole town watching him and the full weight of Harold Crane's legacy pressing down from every direction, he understood something that he had not fully understood when this had all begun 8 days ago. He was in love with her. He had been falling toward that truth from the very first morning. 8 days earlier, Redemption Creek had woken to frost on the ground and blood on the floor of Harold Crane's study, and Thomas Yancey had been the first lawman through the door. The Crane estate sat on the eastern edge of town, 3 stories of whitewashed wood and imported brick that announced its owner's wealth with the bluntness of a fist. Thomas had ridden out at first light after a breathless stable boy named Illy came pounding on the sheriff's office door. Sheriff Ben Adler was down with a fever that had him half out of his mind, which meant the call fell to Thomas, which meant that on the morning of October the 9th, 1882, It was Thomas Yancey who stepped over the threshold of that study and looked at what remained of Harold Crane. The man had been shot once, through the chest, at close range. The bullet had done its work efficiently. There was a glass of bourbon on the desk, barely touched, and a letter half written on expensive stationery, and a woman's shawl draped across the back of the chair opposite the desk, as though its owner had left in a hurry. The shawl was deep blue wool with embroidered edges, and Thomas had stared at it for a long time before he asked the question he already half knew the answer to. Who was here last night? He said to Marcus Webb, Crane's estate manager, a thin man with nervous hands who had been hovering in the doorway. Marcus cleared his throat. Miss Mercer came at around 8 o'clock. They had a meeting. I left them to it. I heard the shot around 9. And Miss Mercer, gone when I came down. That is her shawl. Thomas had taken that information and turned it over very carefully in his mind, the way a man turns over a piece of wood to check for rot. Something about it did not sit right. Something about the arrangement of that room, the half-written letter, the position of the body, the untouched bourbon. He had been a deputy for 4 years in Redemption Creek, and before that he had served in Kansas and before that in New Mexico. And he had learned to trust the feeling that came when something was arranged just a little too neatly. But the evidence was what it was, and Sheriff Adler from his SICT had told him to bring Genevieve Mercer in for questioning. And so Thomas had ridden to the small house on Birch Lane where she lived alone, and where, at 7 in the morning on a cold October day, he had knocked on the door and waited. She had opened it after a long pause, already dressed, which he noted. She was wearing a dark gray dress and her hair was pulled back simply, and she had looked at him with eyes that were tired in the way of a person who had not slept, not in the way of a person trying to appear calm. There was a difference, and Thomas Yancey knew it. "Deputy," she had said, "Miss Mercer, I need you to come with me." She had not argued, she had not asked why. She had simply looked at him for a moment with those steady green eyes and then turned back inside to collect her coat, and Thomas had stood on her front step in the cold morning air, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He told himself it was professional consideration, caution, the recognition that this situation was more complicated than it appeared. He told himself a great many things over the days that followed, and almost none of them were entirely true. Genevieve Mercer had come to Redemption Creek 18 months ago from Denver, where she had worked as a seamstress, and before that, as a schoolteacher in a town whose name she rarely mentioned. She had set up a small dressmaking business on the main street, and she had kept to herself in the way that people who have learned hard lessons tend to do. And she had built a quiet life with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that quiet lives do not build themselves. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention easily. She was not loud or bold in the way some women were. But she had a particular quality of stillness that Thomas had noticed the first time he had ever seen her, passing her shop on his afternoon rounds, and he had noticed it again every time after that. And he had filed it away in the same mental drawer where he kept things he was not ready to examine too closely. That drawer had been thrown wide open the morning he walked her to the jail. They had walked in silence for the first block, and then she had said, without looking at him, "I did not kill Harold Crane." "I know," Thomas said. He had not meant to say that. It had come out the way true things sometimes do, without ceremony or preparation, and he felt her glance at him sharply and then look away again. "Then why are you taking me in?" she asked. "Because I need to understand what happened," he said. "And because if I do not bring you in properly, someone else will come for you in a manner that is a great deal less courteous." She had been quiet for another half a block, and then she said, "The courteous arrest. I shall add it to my list of unusual experiences." Despite everything, despite the frost and the gravity and the awareness of what was at stake, Thomas had almost smiled. He had put her in the one clean cell, the one at the back that had a window that faced the mountains, and he had told her she was not being charged with anything yet, and he had set himself to the work of finding out the truth before someone else manufactured a more convenient version of it. The trouble with Harold Crane was that everyone in Redemption Creek owed him something. He had financed half the businesses on the main street. He had funded the church's new roof and the school's new desks. He had donated a prize bull to the county fair 3 years running and shaken hands with every man who had a vote or an opinion. He was, by all visible measures, the beating heart of this community. He was also, as Thomas had come to understand over 4 years in this town, the kind of man who understood that generosity and power were the same currency spent in different ways. The afternoon of the first day, Thomas sat down across from Genevieve in her cell with a cup of coffee for each of them, and his notebook open on his knee, and asked her to tell him everything. She had looked at the coffee for a moment, then at him, and then she had begun to talk. She had known Harold Crane because he was a customer. He had commissioned several items of clothing from her shop over the past year, shirts mostly, and she had delivered them professionally, and had given the matter no further thought. Then, about 3 months ago, he had asked her to come to his estate for a meeting, which she found unusual, and when she arrived he had explained that he knew something about her past, and that he wanted her to perform a service for him. Thomas watched her face very carefully while she said this. "What kind of service?" he asked. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly. "He knew that I had been married before, in Denver. My husband's name was Robert Dalton. He was not a good man, and I left him and I came here to start over. Harold Crane knew about Robert. He knew that Robert had died, and he knew how he had died, and he wanted me to sign a document attesting to something false about that death." "What document?" Robert owed Harold Crane a substantial sum of money. "Harold Crane wanted me to sign a statement saying that Robert had verbally promised to transfer the deed to a piece of property in exchange for that debt, a piece of property that was now legally mine as Robert's widow. If I signed, I surrendered the property. If I did not sign, he would make certain that the nature of Robert's death became public knowledge, and I would be run out of this town the way I was run out of the last one." The room had a quality of silence around her words that made Thomas feel the full weight of each one. "How did your husband die?" he asked, because he had to. She held his gaze without flinching. "He came home drunk and violent, as he did most nights, and he fell down a flight of stairs. I was at the bottom of those stairs at the time. I had a bruise across my jaw and 2 cracked ribs that I treated myself because I was too ashamed to see a doctor. The coroner ruled it an accident. Harold Crane had a different interpretation that he was prepared to share with anyone who would listen." Thomas set down his coffee cup very deliberately and said nothing for a moment. "You did not sign the document," he said. "No, I refused. I told him I would find another way. I told him he did not know me as well as he thought he did. And then he turned up dead." "And then he turned up dead," she said quietly. "And there I was, the most obvious answer to the most obvious question." Thomas had closed his notebook and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Tell me everything you did after you left his estate that night. Every detail. Where you went and who saw you." She had gone directly home. She had spoken to no one. She had sat in her kitchen and drunk a cup of tea and tried to decide what to do about a man who had her trapped from every direction. And then at some point she had heard the distant sound of what might have been a gunshot, and then nothing until morning. No alibi. No witnesses. No way to prove where she had been. Thomas had left her there and gone to work. The second day was when he found the letter, not the half-written letter on Crane's desk, which the prosecutor's office had already claimed as evidence. A different letter, tucked into the lining of a leather satchel in Crane's private study, a room that most people in Redemption Creek did not know existed. Thomas knew about it because 4 years of working in this town had taught him where the hidden rooms were, both literal and figurative. One of Crane's former employees, a man named Pete Holloway, who had been let go under unpleasant circumstances and who now worked at the livery stable, had mentioned the room once in passing, and Thomas had filed that away in the same careful drawer where he kept everything important. The letter was addressed to a man named Carter Sloan in Pueblo, Colorado, and it was dated 3 weeks before Crane's death, and it was, in the plain language of greed and conspiracy, an outline of a plan to acquire approximately 14,000 acres of land in the northern county by means that would not survive scrutiny from any honest judge. Harold Crane had not been blackmailing only Genevieve Mercer. He had been systematically squeezing every person in the surrounding area who had a secret and a piece of land he wanted, and he had been doing it methodically for at least 2 years, and the letter to Carter Sloan in Pueblo made clear that Crane had a partner who shared both the plan and the proceeds. Thomas had sat in that hidden room for a long time, reading and rereading. If Harold Crane had been blackmailing multiple people, then any one of them might have had reason to kill him, which meant the case against Genevieve was built on the convenience of her shawl and her presence at the house, rather than on any actual evidence of her guilt. But more than that, the letter to Carter Sloan suggested something else. It suggested that someone with a great deal to lose might have a powerful interest in making certain that Genevieve Mercer was convicted quickly and quietly, before anyone started asking the right questions. He pocketed the letter, put the satchel back exactly as he had found it, and rode back to town with his mind working at a speed that made the rest of the world feel very slow. Day 3 was when the trouble started in earnest. Thomas returned to the jailhouse in the late afternoon to find that Sheriff Adler had sent a message from his SICT requesting that the formal charge of murder be filed against Genevieve Mercer by the end of the week, citing pressure from the town council, which was largely composed of men who had done business with Harold Crane and had a unified interest in a swift resolution. The message was written in Adler's shaky hand and smelled, faintly, of the mentholated camphor that Mrs. Adler used on the sheriff during his illnesses. Thomas had read it twice, and then folded it and put it in his vest pocket and went to check on Genevieve. She was sitting on the narrow cot with a book open on her knees, one that the Reverend's wife had brought over along with a basket of cornbread, and a look of complicated sympathy. The book was a volume of poetry, and she looked up when Thomas came in with the expression of someone who had been reading without really reading, using the words as somewhere to put her eyes while her mind worked elsewhere. "The town council wants charges filed," Thomas said, because he had decided early on that she deserved honesty even when honesty was not comfortable. She closed the book. When? End of the week. She absorbed this quietly. Outside, a horse passed on the main street and someone called out a greeting that was answered cheerfully, and everything beyond those jailhouse walls sounded like a completely different world. "What have you found?" she asked. He pulled the chair from the corner and turned it backward, and sat down with his arms folded across the top rung, and told her about the letter, and about Carter Sloan, and about the pattern that was beginning to emerge from Harold Crane's buried affairs. He watched her face while he spoke, the way her composure held itself together with the kind of concentrated effort that most people would mistake for coldness, and he felt the now familiar sensation in his chest that he was steadily running out of ways to avoid acknowledging. Carter Sloane, she said when he finished. He was at Harold's estate twice while I was there for fittings. A heavy man, always in a gray coat. He had a way of looking at me that I did not like. What way? As though he was calculating something, she said. The way a person looks at livestock at a fair, assessing. Thomas absorbed this and filed it alongside everything else. I need to go to Pueblo, he said. You cannot go to Pueblo. You have no jurisdiction in Pueblo, and if you leave town for 2 days, your sheriff will file those charges while you are gone. She was entirely correct. He had arrived at the same conclusion approximately 3 minutes before having the conversation, and hearing it laid out in her practical, measured voice made it feel both more impossible and more necessary to solve. There are other people I can talk to here, he said. Crane had a ledger. His bookkeeper is a man named Alton Price, who lives above the hardware store and who, by my reckoning, is someone who knows a great deal about the private financial arrangements of the most powerful man in this county. Will he talk? He will if I find the right door to knock on, Thomas said. He had said it with more confidence than he felt, but there are moments when confidence is the only tool available, and a man who is trying to save someone's life has to make the best use of what he has. That night, he sat in the sheriff's office with the lamp burning low and worked through everything he had, and somewhere around midnight, he allowed himself the thought he had been avoiding since the morning he walked her to this building. The thought that this mattered to him in a way that went considerably beyond professional obligation. The thought that the idea of this particular woman hanging for something she did not do was not merely unjust in the abstract sense, but was something that landed in his chest with a physical weight that would not shift. He had been married once briefly, a decade ago. A woman named Clara, who had died of a fever in New Mexico, before they had managed to build anything worth the name of a life. He had carried that grief for a long time, carried it the way men carry things they cannot set down, and at some point, the grief had turned into a kind of habitual solitude that he had mistaken for contentment. He was 31 years old and he lived alone above the hardware store, not above the same hardware store as Alton Price, a different one, and he ate his meals at the Juniper House diner and did his job with the steady, unhurried reliability that had made him the best deputy in 4 counties and the man most likely to still be here doing the same job in another 20 years. That was who he had been, up until 8 days ago. He snuffed out the lamp at midnight and lay down on the cot in the empty second cell and did not sleep for a very long time. Day 4 was when he found the door to knock on. Alton Price was 52 years old and had kept Harold Crane's books for 11 years, and had, during those 11 years, accumulated a very comprehensive and very secret understanding of every financial transaction his employer had ever made. He was also, as Thomas discovered during an hour-long conversation in the back room of the hardware store with the door locked and the shades drawn, a man who was afraid. He had a daughter in Denver who was 22 years old and who had recently applied for a position as a school administrator, and Harold Crane had used that daughter as leverage. Nothing overt, nothing that could be proven, just a word dropped here and there about the girl's past, about a youthful indiscretion that Crane had somehow become aware of, with the clear implication that the word could be dropped further and more loudly if Alton Price ever found his conscience inconvenient. Thomas had listened to all of this with the controlled patience of a man who understood that this kind of story required its own pace, and then he had said, very quietly, "Harold Crane is dead, Mr. Price. Whatever he held over you is buried with him." Alton Price had been silent for a long time. "Carter Sloane is not buried with him," he said finally. And then, because he was a man who had been frightened for a long time and who was very tired of it. Alton Price began to talk. What came out over the next 2 hours was a complete picture. Harold Crane and Carter Sloane had been partners for 7 years in a land acquisition scheme that operated on the principle that fear was cheaper than purchase price. They had identified landowners in the county who had secrets, and they had applied pressure systematically and methodically. And when pressure was insufficient, they had arranged for other means. 2 men that Thomas knew the names of had left the county under unexplained circumstances in the past 3 years. One woman had sold her property for a price so far below value that it amounted to theft, and she had left for Kansas and never come back. Genevieve Mercer had been resistant. She had refused to sign. She had made clear that she would find another way, and Harold Crane had apparently made clear to Carter Sloane that the Mercer problem was becoming complicated. Sloane came to the estate 3 days before Harold died, Alton Price said. They had an argument. I heard some of it. Sloane said they could not afford loose ends. Harold said he had it handled. Sloane said he was coming back and Harold had better have it handled by the time he did. Thomas had gone very still. Carter Sloane was at the estate the night Harold Crane died. Alton Price looked at him for a long, careful moment. I saw his horse, he said, tied to the post behind the kitchen garden. I saw it when I left at 7 o'clock. It was gone by the time the shot was heard. The shot was heard at 9. Thomas was on his feet before Alton Price had finished the sentence. Day 5 was when everything tried to fall apart. Sheriff Adler, rallied somewhat by his fever breaking, had come into the office in the morning looking gray and determined, and had sat down across from Thomas with the expression of a man who has made a decision that he is not proud of, but has made nonetheless. I need to file those charges, Thomas, he said. Give me 3 more days, Thomas said. The town council is breathing down my neck. The Crane family's lawyer arrived from Denver this morning. 3 more days is not something I have to give. I have a witness who can place Carter Sloane at the Crane estate the night of the murder, Thomas said. Sheriff Adler looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 30 years as a lawman in a town that owed its existence to the money of powerful people, and he had made accommodations over those years that had not destroyed him, but had worn certain edges smooth. Carter Sloane is a respected businessman in Pueblo, Adler said carefully. Carter Sloane is a murderer, Thomas said, and there was nothing careful in the way he said it. Adler had rubbed his face with both hands and then looked out the window at the main street and then looked back at Thomas. What do you need? I need you to hold off the charges until I have enough to take to a judge. You have until Friday, Adler said. That is 4 days, Thomas, 4 days. It was Thursday morning. 4 days until Friday technically gave him until next Friday, but he understood from Adler's tone that the man meant the Friday that was tomorrow, and he nodded and stood up and went back to work. He spent Thursday afternoon riding from property to property, talking to every former Crane employee, every neighboring landowner, every person who had ever had a transaction with the man that might have left a scar. He found a rancher named Dwight who had sold 200 acres to Crane under what he now understood to be duress, and who was willing to make a sworn statement. He found a widow named Mrs. Pell who had a signed document from Crane that contained language she had not understood at the time of signing, but which Alton Price had since explained to her in terms that made its coercive nature very clear. He was building a picture. It was a detailed, careful, damning picture, but it had one essential gap. He could not put Carter Sloane's hand on the gun. He could place Sloane at the estate. He could establish motive. He could demonstrate that the case against Genevieve Mercer was circumstantial and convenient. But in a courtroom in 1882, in a Colorado county, where the law and the money had been sleeping in the same bed for years, circumstantial and convenient was often enough to hang a person who had nobody of standing to speak for them. Which was why, on Thursday evening, he had gone back to Genevieve's cell with 2 bowls of the Juniper House's beef stew, and the knowledge that he was going to have to ask her something difficult. She had looked at the stew and then at him and said, "You look like a man who has had an expensive week." "Expensive is one word for it," he said, settling into the chair that was becoming something close to his by habit. They had eaten in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is full of things unsaid, and then he had set his bowl aside and said, "The property your husband left you. The piece that Crane wanted. Where is it?" "North of Denver. About 40 acres. A small house on it." "I have never been there. Do you have the deed?" "It is in a tin box under the floorboard in my kitchen. 2nd board from the left wall, 3 boards from the front." He had looked at her. "If you are going to arrest a woman on circumstantial evidence," she said quietly, "it is best to have your documents somewhere they will not be found during a search." "I need to get that deed," he said. If the property is what this was all about, then having the deed in evidence establishes the motive someone had for framing you. It shows what Crane stood to gain, and why silencing you by hanging you was preferable to having you walk around the county as a person who had refused him. She was quiet for a moment. "The deed is in my name. If it is entered as evidence, it becomes part of a public record. Carter Sloane will know it exists." "Sloane already knows it exists. The question is whether a judge gets to know it exists before or after you are convicted." She had looked at the window and its rectangle of dark mountain sky for a while, and then she said, "There is something else. In the tin box with the deed there is a letter. Robert wrote it before he died. He wrote a great many things in his dark moments, and this was one of them. It is not a confession exactly, but it is close. He knew Harold Crane. He had dealings with him. There are things in that letter that may be useful to you." Thomas had felt the shift in the air between them, the way the weight of trust is heavier than the weight of secrecy and lands differently when it is given freely. "I will get it tonight," he said. He had gone to Birch Lane at 10 o'clock that night with a lamp, and let himself in with the spare key that the Reverend's wife, who had a key to nearly every home in town for emergency purposes, had provided after a carefully worded explanation. He had counted boards and lifted the 2nd from the left and found the tin box exactly where she said it would be, and he had taken it out and sat on Genevieve Mercer's kitchen floor in the lamplight and opened it. The deed was there, clean and legal, her name on it in clear copperplate. And below the deed was Robert Dalton's letter. It was 6 pages long, written in a hand that got increasingly uneven as it progressed, in the way of a man who had been drinking while he wrote. It described a business arrangement with Harold Crane that had begun 4 years ago, an arrangement by which Robert Dalton provided introductions to property owners throughout the Denver area in exchange for a percentage of Crane's acquisitions. It described how the arrangement had gone wrong. It described how Harold Crane had decided that a living partner who knew too much was less convenient than a dead one, and how Robert had begun to understand this only after it was too late to do anything about it except write a letter and put it in a tin box. Robert Dalton had not fallen down those stairs entirely by accident. Thomas had sat with that letter for a very long time. In the morning he had gone back to Genevieve and told her what the letter said, and she had listened with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and then said, in a voice that was very controlled and very tired, "I wondered. I never let myself think it clearly, but I wondered." "He tried to protect you," Thomas said. In his way, he left you the letter. He left me a great deal of trouble too, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the plain acknowledgement of a complicated truth. The letter establishes a direct connection between Harold Crane and your husband's death, Thomas said. It establishes a pattern of behavior. Combined with Alton Price's testimony and the letter I found in the hidden study, it gives a judge a very different story than the one the town council once told. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been very busy on my behalf, Deputy Yancey. Thomas, he said, and was not entirely sure why he said it, except that they had spent enough of this week in difficult honesty that his title felt suddenly like a formality neither of them needed. She had looked at him with those green eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then said, very quietly, Thomas. And that had been the moment he stopped pretending he did not know what was happening to him. Day 6 was when Carter Sloane made his move. Thomas had known it was coming. When you start pulling at threads that connect to powerful people in distant cities, those people eventually feel the pull. He had been careful, but careful is not the same as invisible. And Alton Price, for all his newfound willingness to talk, had a limited ability to keep a secret from the man who had frightened him for 11 years. Sloane arrived in Redemption Creek on horseback in the late afternoon, with 2 men, Thomas did not know but whose manner he recognized in the way that men who have been working the law for a long time recognize certain other men. They rode down the main street with the unhurried confidence of people who have arrived to resolve a situation, and they went directly to the Crane estate, where Harold Crane's brother, a man named Edward who had traveled from Denver for the funeral and stayed for the property implications, was waiting. Thomas watched them ride past from the doorway of the hardware store, and then he went back to the jailhouse and sat down and spent 20 minutes thinking very hard. By the time he stood up, he had a plan, and the plan had a central flaw, which was that it required him to be in 3 places at once, and he was one person with a deputy's badge and a limited number of allies in a town that was, at this particular moment, arranged against him. He went to find Pete Holloway at the livery stable. Pete Holloway was a compact, quiet man of about 40 who had worked for Harold Crane for 7 years and been dismissed 2 years ago for a reason that Pete described as creative bookkeeping, and that Thomas, knowing what he now knew about Harold Crane's financial arrangements, understood was more likely a refusal to falsify a document. Pete had no love for Harold Crane's memory and no allegiance to the interests that Crane represented, and when Thomas laid out what he needed, Pete had looked at him with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this conversation. "What do you need me to do?" Pete said. "I need you to go to Judge Price's house tonight and give him these documents," Thomas said. He handed over a carefully assembled envelope containing copies of everything he had gathered. "Tell him I am requesting an emergency hearing first thing tomorrow morning on the grounds that new evidence has emerged that fundamentally changes the nature of the case against Genevieve Mercer. Tell him I will present the full evidence in court. And if he says no—" "He will not say no," Thomas said, with a certainty he had earned through 4 years of watching Judge Harlan Price run his courtroom with the rigid integrity of a man who had seen too many injustices to be comfortable with one more. "Price is the one honest thing in this county. He has been waiting for a reason to look at Harold Crane's affairs for a long time." Pete had taken the envelope and gone. Thomas had gone back to the jailhouse, and then, because the evening felt suddenly too big to be alone in, he had gone back to Genevieve's cell. She was awake. She had not been sleeping much, which was understandable, and she had been using the nighttime hours to do the only useful thing available to her, which was think. She had been thinking, she told him, about what happened after. After, he said, after this is resolved, one way or another. She looked at her hands. If it goes wrong, if they charge me and the judge does not see the evidence clearly, I have been thinking about what I would do. It is not going to go wrong, he said. You do not know that. No, he admitted. But I know what I am prepared to do. She looked at him steadily. Which is what? And he had said, without much premeditation, whatever it takes. The silence after that was different from the previous silences. It had a weight to it that was not heavy in the way of dread, but heavy in the way of things that matter, the way a decision feels when it has finally been made after being avoided for a long time. You have been very kind to me, she said finally. Kinder than you needed to be. It is not kindness, he said, and he said it plainly, looking at her directly, and she looked back at him with the same openness, and neither of them elaborated on that statement, because some things at the right moment do not need elaboration. He had slept on the cot in the empty cell again that night, and in the morning he had found the message from Judge Price granting the emergency hearing, and he had felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the particular relief of being on the right side of a thing and knowing it. Day 7 was preparation. He organized his evidence with the careful deliberation of a man building something that has to stand up. He wrote out the sequence of events in clear, logical order. He arranged the documents. The letter from Harold Crane's hidden study to Carter Sloane, Robert Dalton's letter from the tin box, the deed to the Denver property, Alton Price's statement, Pete Holloway's statement about the hidden room, Dwight the rancher's statement about the coerced land sale, Mrs. Pell's documentation of her manipulated contract. It was a portrait of systematic abuse of power, and it was thorough, and it pointed clearly and convincingly in a direction that was not Genevieve Mercer. But he knew that documents were not always enough. He knew that, in a room full of people whose livelihoods were tied to the legacy of Harold Crane, the presentation of evidence could be neutralized by doubt, by the slow erosion of testimony under cross-examination, by the simple human preference for a neat and finished story over a complicated and unsettling one. The neat story was that a woman with a motive had killed a man. The complicated story was that an entire web of corruption had finally consumed one of its architects, and that the woman was a convenient diversion. He needed something more. He found it at 7 o'clock that evening when a young woman knocked on the jailhouse door. She was about 20 years old, with a round face and frightened eyes, and she gave her name as Lucy Crane, which made Thomas very still, because that was a name he knew. Lucy was Harold Crane's niece, the daughter of the brother Edward who was currently at the estate with Carter Sloane and his 2 associates. She had come alone, she said, without telling her father, and she had come because she could not sleep, and she could not stay silent anymore. She had been in the Crane estate on the night Harold died. Not in the main house, in the side building where the household staff kept their supplies, where she sometimes went when she could not sleep and wanted to be somewhere quiet. She had been there when she heard the argument. Not Genevieve Mercer's voice. A man's voice, raised and sharp, and then Harold's voice, strained and frightened in a way she had never heard it before, and then the shot. She had not come forward because her father had told her not to, and because she was afraid of Carter Sloane, who looked at her in the same calculating way that Genevieve had described, and because she was 20 years old and alone in a world where the men around her had all the structural power and she had only her conscience. But she had come now. Thomas had taken her statement very carefully and very completely, and when she was done, he had thanked her with the genuine and unguarded sincerity of a man who has just received exactly the thing he needed at exactly the moment he needed it, and he had asked her if she would testify in court. She had been silent for a long time. Then she said yes. Day 8 was today. The courtroom was packed because in a small town in 1882, a murder trial was the most significant communal event short of a natural disaster. And this one had the additional charge of involving the most prominent man in the county. Thomas had arrived early and arranged his evidence and spoken briefly with Genevieve before they brought her out, and she had looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "Whatever happens." "Whatever happens," he had agreed, but it had not unfolded the way he expected. The prosecutor, a man named Holt who had been brought in from Colorado Springs specifically for this case, and who had the polished confidence of a man accustomed to winning in rooms where the outcome is already arranged, had moved quickly and efficiently through his opening, painting Genevieve as a woman with a clear motive and an established presence at the scene, and no alibi worthy of the name. He had the shawl entered as evidence. He had Marcus Webb's testimony confirmed in writing, and then he had done something Thomas had not anticipated. He had introduced a second witness, a man named George Ferris, who claimed to have been walking past Harold Crane's property at approximately 9 o'clock on the night in question, and who claimed to have seen, through the study window, a woman matching Genevieve Mercer's description in the room with Harold Crane immediately before the shot was fired. It was a lie. Thomas knew it was a lie with the completeness of a man who had spent a week understanding exactly what had happened and exactly who had arranged what. George Ferris was not a random witness. He was a man with outstanding debts to the Crane estate and a history of accommodation that made his integrity a very limited commodity. But the room had shifted with his testimony. Thomas could feel it. Could feel the way doubt settled over the jury like dust after a wind, and could feel the prosecutor building toward the motion to proceed to verdict without full defense presentation, exploiting the technical circumstances of the filing timeline that his office had helped to create. It was at this point that Thomas Yancey had stood up. And now he was standing at the front of the courtroom with the judge looking down at him and the room erupting around him. And he had said the thing that had put every last card he had on the table, all at once. No reservation, no strategy, just the plain and complete truth of where he stood. Judge Price brought the gavel down 3 more times and achieved something approaching order. He looked at Thomas over his spectacles for a very long moment. "Deputy Yancey," he said, "you understand what you are saying." "I do, Your Honor. You are a sworn officer of the law in this county. You are stating in public record that you personally vouch for the character and innocence of the accused." "I am, Your Honor. And I am also requesting that the court receive evidence that I have gathered over the past 7 days which materially changes the nature of this case, which establishes an alternative suspect with motive and opportunity, and which demonstrates that the case against Miss Mercer is built on manufactured witness testimony and the deliberate exploitation of circumstantial connection." The prosecutor, Holt, was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is entirely irregular. The deputy has no standing to present evidence at this stage of proceedings. His personal vouching for the accused calls his professional impartiality into serious question." "My impartiality is intact," Thomas said, turning to face Holt with a calm that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with certainty. "I have spent 7 days following evidence wherever it led. The evidence led away from Miss Mercer and toward a pattern of criminal conspiracy that resulted in Harold Crane's death at the hands of someone who had far more to gain from it than a woman defending a piece of property she had never even visited." "This is speculation," Holt said. "I have documents," Thomas said. "I have sworn statements and I have an eyewitness." The room went very quiet again. Judge Price set down his gavel. He looked at Thomas and then at Genevieve and then at the prosecutor and then back at Thomas. "You will present this evidence," he said. "In full. I am continuing this hearing." The next 2 hours were the most concentrated exercise in truth-telling that Thomas Yancey had ever undertaken in a courtroom. He presented the documents one by one, explaining each one's significance clearly and without embellishment. He called Alton Price, who testified with the visible relief of a man who has been carrying a weight too long and is finally setting it down. He called Pete Holloway. He called Dwight the rancher and Mrs. Pell. And then he called Lucy Crane. The room's reaction to Lucy Crane was the pivot point. There was a quality of shock in the way people received her testimony that went beyond surprise into something more fundamental. The recognition that the story they had been told was not the story that had happened. Lucy's voice was steady, and her account was clear and specific and completely at odds with the sequence of events the prosecution had constructed. And when Holt tried to cross-examine her with the implication that she was confused or mistaken, she looked at him with the unflappable directness of someone who has made a decision in full knowledge of its cost and is not retreating from it. At the conclusion of Lucy's testimony, Thomas presented the letter from Harold Crane's hidden study to Carter Sloane, and he explained in clear terms who Carter Sloane was and where he currently was, which was, based on Thomas's morning surveillance, still at the Crane estate on the edge of town. He ended by returning to George Ferris, the prosecution's convenient eyewitness, and laying out very precisely the financial relationship between Ferris and the Crane estate, the outstanding debts, the history of accommodation, and the structural impossibility of the view that Ferris claimed to have had through the study window given the angle of the window and the height of the garden wall, which Thomas had measured himself on day 5. Judge Price had listened to all of it with his hands folded and his expression giving nothing away, and when Thomas finished, the judge sat in silence for a full minute that felt considerably longer. Then he said, "I am dismissing the charges against Miss Mercer on the grounds that the prosecution has failed to establish a case beyond reasonable doubt, and that substantial evidence exists pointing to alternative suspects. I am additionally ordering the immediate detainment of Carter Sloane pending further investigation into the events of October the 9th and into the broader criminal conspiracy outlined in the evidence presented today. This court will cooperate with authorities in Pueblo as necessary." He paused. "And I will note for the record that the conduct of Deputy Thomas Yancey in this investigation represents the standard to which this county's law enforcement should aspire." He brought the gavel down once finally, and it sounded entirely different from the way it had sounded at the beginning. Genevieve was standing when the bailiff cut the rope from her wrists, standing very still while the room moved around her in a surge of noise and reaction. And Thomas crossed to her through the crowd with a speed and directness that had nothing official about it. She looked at him, and her composure, which had held through everything, the arrest and the cell and the week of uncertainty and the courtroom this morning, gave way in the way that things give way when the emergency is finally over, and the body remembers it was frightened all along. Not tears exactly, though her eyes were bright, something more like the release of a breath held for 8 days. "You risked your position," she said. "I did," he said. "You risked your name." "Yes." "Why?" she asked, though the way she asked it made clear she was not asking because she did not know. She was asking because she wanted to hear him say it, and he understood that. "Because some things are worth the risk," he said, "and because I could not have done otherwise." They were standing very close in the moving crowd, and the noise of it was receding from Thomas's awareness, the way sounds recede when you are paying complete attention to something closer. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "You could have dinner with me," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone processing the shift from one kind of gravity to another. And then something in her face opened in the way of a window that has been shut for a long time against weather that has finally cleared. "That seems like a reasonable beginning," she said. Carter Sloane was detained that afternoon by Thomas and 2 deputies, who rode to the Crane estate with Judge Price's written order, and found Sloane attempting to leave by the back road with his 2 associates and 2 saddlebags containing a substantial quantity of documents and cash. His arrest was not without complication, as the 2 associates were not immediately cooperative, but the matter was resolved without serious injury, and with the full weight of the law applied to all 3 men. The subsequent investigation, which occupied the following weeks, and drew in authorities from Pueblo and eventually from Denver, established Carter Sloane as the person responsible for Harold Crane's death, executed when it became clear that Crane's increasingly erratic behavior in the face of Genevieve's refusal to comply was threatening to expose the entire operation. Sloane had calculated, correctly as he thought, that a woman with a complicated past and no powerful allies in the county would make a satisfactorily permanent scapegoat. He had not calculated on Thomas Yancey. George Ferris recanted his testimony, which surprised no one, and the charges against him for perjury were ultimately handled with the pragmatic mercy of a system that needed his honest account of who had approached him more than it needed his punishment. Edward Crane, faced with the complete exposure of his brother's methods, returned to Denver and made no further claims on the affairs of Redemption Creek. The town, stripped of the organizing principle of Harold Crane's dominance, settled into a period of genuine reconstruction that was slower and more complicated and ultimately more honest than what had come before. And on a cold, clear evening in late October, Thomas Yancey sat across from Genevieve Mercer at a corner table in the Juniper House with 2 plates of roasted chicken and 2 cups of coffee, and the particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with occasion and everything to do with a person. They talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with courts or evidence, about where she had grown up, about the sister she missed, about the schoolroom in the unnamed town where she had taught children their letters and their numbers before her life had taken the turn it had taken, about the brother he had lost to a fever the same year he lost Clara, about New Mexico and the quality of its light, about what a person does with their life after the difficult chapters have been closed. He walked her home along the frost-bright streets of Redemption Creek, and at the gate of the small house on Birch Lane, they stood in the cold air for a moment looking at each other with the clear-eyed attention of 2 people who have seen each other under the worst circumstances and have not found the sight wanting. "I want to do this again," he said. "All of this, the talking, the dinner, walking you home." "I want that too," she said, simply and without qualification, and the plainness of it was worth more to him than any elaboration would have been. The weeks that followed were, in their way, the best Thomas Yancey had ever spent. He was still a deputy. He still did his rounds and filed his reports and dealt with the ordinary friction of a town in transition. But he spent his evenings at Genevieve's shop, which had a comfortable room in the back that she used for consultations, sitting in the chair by the window while she worked, and they talked the way people talk when they have decided to be known to each other, fully and without reservation. He learned that she was funny in the dry, observational way of someone who has trained herself not to make too much noise about the things she finds ridiculous. He learned that she could sew a buttonhole in 30 seconds flat, and that she had opinions about coffee that he found excessive and agreed with completely. He learned that she had named a stray cat that visited her kitchen door Henry, and that she talked to Henry as though the cat had thoughts worth engaging with, which Thomas decided was not evidence of eccentricity, but of a fundamental generosity of spirit. She learned that he could build a fire in any conditions, and that he had read more books than his exterior suggested, and that he had a habit of going very quiet when something mattered to him a great deal, a stillness that she had initially read as distance and had come to understand was its opposite. She learned that he was the kind of man who shows up reliably, not spectacularly but consistently, and that this quality, which she had not had in her life before, was more valuable than anything spectacular. He asked her properly one evening in December, standing in her kitchen with a light snow falling outside the window, and Henry the cat observing from the corner with apparent indifference. He did not have a ring because he had not had time to arrange one, and he said so plainly. And she said that the ring was not the relevant part, and he said no. The relevant part was this, and he told her what he felt with the same plain directness he brought to everything important, and she had said yes before he quite finished the sentence. They were married in February of 1883 in the Redemption Creek Church with the new roof, the one that Harold Crane had paid for, which was perhaps the only useful thing the man had ever done with his money. The Reverend, whose wife had supplied the key and the cornbread and the complicated sympathy, performed the ceremony with the visible satisfaction of someone who has hoped for an outcome and seen it arrive. Pete Holloway was there, and Alton Price, and Dwight the rancher and Mrs. Pell, and Lucy Crane, who had come from Denver specifically for the occasion, and who had written to Genevieve in the intervening months a series of letters that had established the beginning of a genuine friendship. Sheriff Adler, fully recovered and somewhat chastened by the events of October, attended and shook Thomas's hand with the sincerity of a man making a quiet amends, and Thomas accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. Genevieve wore a dress she had made herself, deep blue wool with embroidered edges, which was not the shawl she had left at Harold Crane's study, because that was evidence and would remain evidence for some time, but was a deliberate echo of it, a reclamation of the color, which she had explained to Thomas, and which he had understood without requiring further explanation. She moved into the rooms above his shop, and they made it into something together, which is the only way a home is ever really made. She kept her business on the main street, which prospered in the years that followed as the town recovered from the long shadow of Harold Crane's dominance, and new people moved in, and the existing residents rediscovered something like collective self-determination. Thomas was made sheriff the following year when Ben Adler retired, a promotion he accepted with the same quiet reliability with which he had done everything else, and he did the job with the same commitment to the complicated, difficult, unglamorous work of honest law enforcement that had defined his career. In the spring of 1884, they had a son. Thomas wanted to name him James, after Thomas's father, and Genevieve agreed with the condition that the middle name be her father's name, which was Arthur, and so the boy was James Arthur Yancey, and he came into the world on an April morning when the mountains beyond Redemption Creek were still snow-capped, and the meadows below them were full of early wildflowers, and he was loud and healthy and entirely himself from the first moment. Thomas held his son in the jailhouse office, which was now his office, late that night when Genevieve was resting and the baby had finally consented to quiet, and he sat in the lamplight with this new small person who had his nose and Genevieve's stubborn jaw, and he felt the full weight of how much had changed since an October morning when he had knocked on a door on Birch Lane, and a woman with tired green eyes had looked at him and said, simply, "Deputy." He thought about choices, about the moment in a courtroom when he had stood up without a plan and with everything at stake and said the truest thing he knew, He thought about how it had felt like a risk and how from the inside of it, from the place he had been standing when he said it, it had not felt like a risk at all. It had felt like the only thing that made sense. He thought about how that was usually how the right thing felt, not like courage. Like inevitability. James Arthur Yancey went to sleep against his father's chest, small and certain of his safety, and outside the Colorado night went on in the cold, clear, star-filled way that Colorado nights do. And Thomas Yancey sat quietly in the lamplit office and knew himself to be, without reservation, exactly where he was supposed to be. In the months and years that followed the trial and its resolution, Redemption Creek underwent a genuine transformation that no one had quite anticipated. The systematic exposure of Harold Crane's land acquisition scheme, laid out in full by the investigation that followed Carter Sloane's arrest, had revealed that approximately half the properties in the surrounding county had been subject to some form of manipulation. The courts spent a considerable period untangling the resulting claims and counterclaims, and while the process was slow and imperfect, as legal processes in that era tended to be, it resulted in the return of several properties to their rightful owners, and in a general reckoning with the way power had operated in the region for nearly a decade. Thomas, as the sheriff, navigated this period with the measured patience that the situation required. He worked closely with Judge Price, whose integrity remained the fixed point around which the county's legal reconstruction organized itself, and with a new county commissioner named Wallace, who had been elected specifically on a platform of reform, and who had the useful quality of meaning what he said. Genevieve threw herself into the life of the town, with the energy of someone who has been holding back and is now free to stop. Her dressmaking business expanded to include 2 employees, a young woman named Nell who was gifted with a needle and had been struggling to find respectable work, and an older woman named Clara, which Thomas noted with a private internal acknowledgement of the circular kindness of things. She joined the newly reorganized school committee and contributed to the curriculum discussions with the authority of someone who had actually taught children, and her suggestions were adopted with the frequency of practical ideas offered by people who know what they are talking about. She wrote to her sister in Ohio. The sister came to visit in the summer of 1883 and stayed for 3 weeks, and went back having substantially revised her assessment of the Wild West as a universally inhospitable place, and she returned again the following summer and the summer after that, and eventually settled in Pueblo with a schoolteacher she had met on one of her visits, which Genevieve found quietly satisfying and told Thomas she had seen coming from the second visit. The Denver property, the 40 acres with the small house that had been the origin of so much trouble, became an issue that Genevieve and Thomas discussed at length over the winter of 1883. Carter Sloane was convicted in the spring of 1883 of the murder of Harold Crane and of multiple counts of criminal conspiracy and fraud, and he went to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City, where he would remain for the rest of his natural life. The trial was conducted in Denver, and Thomas testified for 3 days and came home afterward looking exhausted in the specific way of a person who has finally, completely, put something down. That evening Genevieve had put James Arthur to sleep and made dinner and sat across from Thomas at the kitchen table and asked him how he felt. He had thought about this for a moment, genuinely considered it. "Finished," he said. "Not in a bad way. In the way of a thing that has been properly completed." She had looked at him across the table with those green eyes that he knew the complete language of now, that he could read with the fluency of long attention and genuine understanding. "Good," she said. "Then we can be finished with it together." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did with the naturalness of a habit established over months of choosing proximity to her whenever possible. And they sat in the lamplit kitchen of the house on Birch Lane while their son slept down the hall and the Colorado spring moved outside the windows, and being finished with the difficult thing felt exactly the way she said it would, like something that had been properly completed. Thomas Yancey lived many years in Redemption Creek and accumulated the particular kind of reputation that belongs to people who have consistently done the right thing even when it was expensive. He was the kind of sheriff about whom stories were told in terms of the specific incidents, the moment in the courtroom, the week of investigation, the arrest of Carter Sloan, not because he encouraged the stories, but because they had the quality of true things that communities return to when they need to remember who they are at their best. He and Genevieve had 3 children in total. James Arthur was followed 2 years later by a second son, William, who had Thomas's dark eyes and Genevieve's way with words, and who grew up to be a schoolteacher in Denver, which pleased his mother in the particular way that things please people when they rhyme with their own lives. The third child was a daughter, born in 1888, who was named Eliza after no one in particular, except that both Thomas and Genevieve had agreed it was the right name when they heard it, which seemed to them a sufficient reason. Eliza grew up with the combined stubbornness of both her parents applied to a personality that was entirely her own, and she was the child who most frequently reminded Thomas of the moment in the courtroom when the right thing had to be done regardless of the cost. The town grew. The railroad came through in 1887, which changed the character of Redemption Creek in the way that railroads always change things, bringing new people and new commerce, and new complications, and new possibilities in roughly equal proportion. Thomas navigated the transition with the equanimity of a man who has learned that change is not the same as loss, and that the useful response to a new situation is attention rather than resistance. He still walked the main street every afternoon on his rounds. He still knew every business, every family, every dog. He still knocked on doors when knocking was required and sat down when sitting was what was needed. He had in his tenure resolved 3 murders, none of them as complicated as the first, stopped 2 bank robberies, managed the aftermath of a flood in the spring of 1886 that damaged half the lower town, and mediated more neighbor disputes and property disagreements than he could accurately count. He did all of it with the same quality of unhurried, reliable attention that had characterized his work from the beginning, and every evening he came home. That was the part he came to understand, over years of doing it, was the real achievement. Not the courtroom or the arrests or the resolution of complicated situations. The coming home. The kitchen and the lamplight and the person across the table who knew him completely and had decided that complete knowledge was not a reason to withdraw, but a foundation to build on. Genevieve's business became the most respected dress shop in the county. She had a reputation for quality and precision that drew customers from towns a full day's ride away, and she managed it with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, expanding carefully, investing in good materials, maintaining the standard that her name was attached to. She served on the school board for 11 years and helped establish a small lending library in the back of the church that grew, over time, into a dedicated building that she was somewhat embarrassed to have her name put on, but that the town insisted. She wrote letters regularly to her sister, to Lucy Crane, who remained a friend across the years and distances, to Nell, who had eventually moved to Cheyenne with her husband, and who sent back letters full of the particular adventure of someone building a new life in a new place. She kept a journal, a habit from the difficult years that had outlasted its original necessity, and become something she did for its own sake. And in it, she wrote with the same plainness and precision that characterized everything she did. On a September evening in 1890, sitting on the porch of their house with Thomas beside her while the last light went off the mountains and James Arthur, who was 6, played in the meadow below the house, and William, who was 4, slept inside, and Eliza, who was 2.5, was attempting to convince Henry the cat, who was very old now and unimpressed by children, to accept a daisy. Genevieve said something she had been thinking about for a while. "I keep thinking about that week," she said. Thomas looked at her. He knew which week she meant. "What about it?" he said. "The morning you walked me to the jail," she said. "You said you knew I had not done it." "I did know that." "You did not know that," she said, not unkindly. "You had met me twice in passing. You had no information." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the meadow where their son was collecting something from the ground, a feather or a stone. "I knew you were telling the truth," he said. "I could see it. Some things you know without having evidence for them. The evidence came later. The knowledge was there from the beginning." She looked at him for a moment with the full, quiet attention that was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she brought her complete self to the important moments. "I was terrified," she said, "that whole week. I was terrified every minute of it, and I was not going to show it because I had already made the decision that I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me afraid, but I was." "I know," he said. "And then you stood up in that courtroom," she said, "in front of everyone." And said that, he agreed. She took his hand, the same hand she had been taking for 7 years across kitchen tables and on Sunday morning walks, and at the side of 2 small sicks, and in the pew of the church, and every ordinary in-between moment that adds up, over time, into a life. "It was the bravest thing I have ever seen," she said. "It was not brave," he said. "It was necessary." "Those are the same thing," she said. The last light went off the mountains. James Arthur came running up from the meadow with his hands full of collected things, feathers and stones and one mud-covered item of uncertain origin. And Eliza abandoned her campaign with Henry, and came to show them both the daisy she had successfully pressed upon the cat's nose before he walked away. And the evening settled around them in the way of evenings that have been earned, warm and specific and entirely theirs. Thomas Yancey looked at his wife in the last of the light, at the face he knew as well as his own, better maybe, with the complete and unguarded love of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for, until he was standing in a courtroom with his whole name on the line, and realized that this was what names were for. Not rank or reputation, or the formal weight of official standing. This. The willingness to put yourself completely forward for the person who matters, in the room where it counts, in front of everyone watching, without reservation and without a fallback plan, because some choices are not really choices at all. They are just the most honest version of who you already are. He had stood before the judge with his name and his badge and everything that went with them and said the true thing, and the true thing had come home with him. And that, in the end, was all there was to it, and all there needed to be.